I want to thank you for staying after today as we talk about this issue of spiritual abuse and the church. We're not just talking about spiritual abuse as it happens within a particular church, but just the reality of it and how we as a church can respond to it in more life-giving ways that make sure that A, it never happens in the first place, and B, that when it happens, we respond appropriately to what happens. Some context here as to why I'm focusing on this. Well, this is the outgrowth of a particular course that I took on spiritual abuse in the church. And so you're getting to see really kind of the fruit that came from the time that I spent in this particular course focusing on spiritual abuse. I was very intrigued by it because it's a reality that we unfortunately encounter often in the life of the church. And it is actually more prevalent than we probably even imagine. So today, my goal is to help you identify, confront, and begin the work towards repair. So this is a threefold movement. We could spend weeks on each of those movements or each of those tasks of identifying abuse, confronting abuse, and repairing in the aftermath of abuse. But today I'm just going to go through it briefly. I'll probably focus a little bit more on the identifying aspect of this because we do need to be equipped with knowing what spiritual abuse is so that we can work towards those practices that will actually help people who have experienced it, unfortunately. So our first part here, we're going to be identifying spiritual abuse, what it is, how it happens, and what factors led to it. We typically think of situations of abuse where there is a person who causes the abuse, the abuser, and the person who is the victim of the abuse. But there's actually a lot more factors going into that. It involves also the community that's around that situation, as well as the institution and all the other practices that go into the life of a community. So I thought of many ways of like how we could do this morning. And instead of using stories that are out there in the news or stories that I've heard, I wanted to use a fictional one that borrows elements of true stories just to protect those in case anybody might be watching this. That way they wouldn't think that their story was being told. So this is kind of a springboard for us to understand what spiritual abuse is. And I'm going to use a fictional story about a church to help you see that. So this is an all too common story. Our new pastor arrived and everything was going well. He was a young, passionate, and energetic leader who preached dynamic sermons. We were growing as a church and new families were joining, but after a few years, we started to hear stories of how the pastor was treating people on staff. We have since lost our children's director. People talked to the board about some concerning signs, but the board, mostly chosen by the pastor, supported him by saying that some of the staff lacked a true faith in Christ and had to be let go. Many don't want to leave the church, which has been their spiritual home for many years, but we feel like something must be done. Now, it's probably not very obvious to us what this church is or how this church is constructed, so let's fill in some details. So let's just imagine that this particular church is an evangelical, non-denominational church. This could be any church, by the way. This is not unique, but I'm using this kind of as a way for us to understand the dynamics, and it's a little bit easier with non-denominational churches because they tend to be standalone entities. So it's an evangelical, non-denominational church located in Atlanta, Georgia. The church demographics, 85% white, 5% black, 5% Hispanic, and 5%/other biracial. The average attendance for this particular church on a given Sunday is about 200 to 350 people. So that kind of gives you a frame to work from of what kind of things are happening in this story that we just told. And again, this is all fictional, but this is an exercise to jolt your imagination so that you can see things. So what do you notice in this story? Number one, the character of the pastor and his mixed reception. So there's this feeling like, oh, a lot of people are coming to the church, the pastor's doing really well, yet there's these concerning signs of other things that are going on. You notice the role of the leadership. We also talk about polity and systems as, the set of governance that a church operates from. So you see that being played out. You see individual and group dynamics at work. All right, you have individuals who are victimized on staff. You have the pastor as an individual, but you also have group dynamics. You have the board acting as one. You have the congregation itself. And the congregation is, whether they're privy to the information or not, they set the context for what's happening. You see the use or misuse of faith and spirituality in the story. You could also see that the congregation is kind of a bystander to what's going on. Bystanders are someone or people who play both roles of perpetrator and victim, often at the same time. The term bystander not only identifies a person's status, Victoria Barnett writes, with regard to a particular event, but implies a certain form of behavior, including the decision to become involved or remain uninvolved. So you probably have in the congregation some of those people who are bystanders who hear of this, and some might choose to get involved in what they hear, and some might not. And how is the nature of what is going wrong articulated in the story? And the key here is that the abuse is not directly or clearly named. We don't exactly know what the pastor is doing to the staff. We just know something's going wrong, and there's a dynamic at work where bad things are happening and people are either responding inappropriately or not responding at all to what is going on. Mainly what you see is the use of power, authority, and control. And I want you to focus on those themes this morning. Power, authority, and control. Who has the power? Who has authority? And what is the nature of that power and authority as it regards control? Well, let's get here, because you're probably wondering, what is spiritual abuse? And as a result, what is spiritual trauma? Well, spiritual abuse, as I define it, is any abusive action that can be emotional, psychological, yes, even physical, that occurs within a religious setting. So abuse that occurs within a religious setting would be spiritual abuse, or makes use of religious symbols in it, and results in the emotional or physical harm or trauma of an individual or group of people. The abuse itself can be perpetuated by an individual, a group, or an institution through the misuse of power and authority, or by the failure to take action resulting in betrayal. Okay, I know that's a mouthful. There's a lot in that, but we're going to see how that works itself out as we go along. Now, as I use trauma refers to the psychological, emotional, physical, and spiritual effects of the abuse upon a person or persons. So trauma is the effect of the abuse. Trauma can be experienced by an individual or a group, but its effects can also ripple throughout a community or society. So we might think of the abuse just happening between two individuals, but because that abuse occurs, it ripples throughout the life of the community itself. It affects everybody. What is power? Now, a lot of us think of power in the negative sense, the misuse of power, but power can actually be a good thing. So power in its ideal form, according to James Newton Poling, is the ability to act in effective ways with the objects and people that make up our perceived world. We all have power in the sense that we have the ability to act. We're actors. Power is often misunderstood as a one-way effect on others, but power is actually organized by the relational webs of which we are part. Power is gauged, he says, by the complexity of the relationships that can be contained in an interaction. Power, in other words, is relational. That is to say, the relative amount of power we have is determined in relation to other persons. So as your pastor, I have a certain set of power. and authority that's conferred upon me. And it's not just something that comes through my title, it's actually something that you as the body agree to and act out of, okay? And that can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. And so what is important in what James Newton Poling is pointing out here, he was actually at he was at Garrett for many years. So James Newton Poling is pointing out the relational webs of power and how that works. It's never just one person with power and others are outside of power, but we all have power in this web. And understanding that's going to help you understand just how difficult spiritual abuse can be to respond to as a community of faith. So can power be a good thing? Yes, according to Judith Herman, justice depends on the social organization of power. Power is a reality, but how we organize it will either produce justice or injustice. You can get what she is saying there. There's two types of power relationships. A power relationship. One is based on dominance and subordination. We see that in forms of tyranny and patriarchy. But one is also based on mutuality and reciprocity. We see that with justice and equality. James Newton Poling also concurs with this. He says that the ideal direction of power in human life that is undistorted by sin and evil is toward communion and an enlarged freedom. In the relational process, human bonding grows stronger and individuals and groups increase their freedom. So when power is used responsibly and well, it should increase the freedom of people around you. It should lead to a greater sense of relationship, of bonding that occurs. But unfortunately, as we know, power can be abused. Poling again notes, the power that is intended by God for everyone who lives is used to destroy relationships in exchange for control. Rather than live in insecurity, some persons choose to create structures that dominate and control others for personal gratification and false security. So I want to spend a moment on that. Why does he put it that way exactly? Well, he notices something about us as humans, that every single human has to face insecurity in life as humans. We are frail, we're vulnerable people, our lives are limited in every way. And so all of us live with a certain level of insecurity about our lives. But some choose to create structures that dominate and control others, not just for personal gratification, but also for false security. They think that the more power that they obtain and control they obtain over others, that means they are more secure. This is just a psychological component of the misuse of power that we often don't recognize. We think of power-hungry people as just selfish people who are trying to just gobble up power, but they have actual psychological things that work within them. They can't deal with the insecurity that they face, especially when you're in a leadership position and you're getting complaints and people saying this and they're doing all these sorts of things. And so the easiest way for you to do it, that at least for them to deal with that insecurity, is to just dominate others, to be tyrannical in your relationships towards them. And so we also see, as Poling notes, that abuse of power relies on institutions and ideologies. So it's not just individual actors, it's also institutions and ideologies. One of the reasons why people often respond to people who have been abused in a careless manner is because their institution or the ideology that they're a part of can't face the reality of another person being abused. There is no way my pastor could have abused you because my pastor speaks word to me, the word of truth to me and encouragement to me. There's just no way. That's ideological stuff working through that person that I would say, there's no way that my pastor could ever do something harmful to somebody else. James Griffith talks about how social hierarchy dictates an uneven distribution of power in groups so that some have more access to resources than others and some do more work of than others. So there's just a natural imbalance of power in any situation. Some just have more access to it, and some don't. This is why we intentionally try to create structures that don't allow those hierarchies to get worse. We try to make them more equal and more just. So let's go back to our story for a moment, and I'm going to break this out. We could talk all day and go back and forth, and if there is, I should mention this, at any point if you're confused by something that I'm talking about or want me to explain a little bit more, just raise your hand and I will explain it. But I know that sometimes when we get right to discussion, we can get off of our path pretty quickly, and so I want to make sure we stay on it. So how can we identify spiritual abuse in this story? Well, number one, we see the misuse of power by who? The pastor and the board. They both have power that the congregation does not have, a power that the congregation assents to by granting them that power, but they have the power and they're misusing it to the detriment of others. We see the weaponization of religious symbols. This is why I talk about spiritual abuse as a use also of spiritual or religious symbols, not just taking place within a religious organization or building. Okay? A pastor can abuse somebody outside the church in a neighborhood. So we got to see that abuse can happen anywhere, but if you're using religion or religious symbols in a way that is abusive, that is a form of spiritual abuse. And how did they do it? By weaponizing faith in Christ. This is probably the most prevalent form of spiritual abuse in the church. Using faith in Jesus against other people by either saying they don't have enough of it or they just simply lack it altogether. Notice easily, we can categorize this as spiritual abuse because it happens within a religious organization. It refers to the pastor's treatment of staff at the church. It could also be the pastor's treatment of members of the church too, but we can see it's obviously taking place within a religious organization. We see that somehow the socio-cultural background may allow this type of behavior to be ignored or dismissed. And I'll get to those factors in a moment. We see that the trauma affects individuals and groups, the staff members themselves and the community of faith. There's people that are picking up on this. Something's going wrong, and they're concerned about it. So we see that the trauma is starting to ripple through the community. The institution, represented by the board, perpetuates the abuse by doing what? By siding with the pastor and or ignoring the claims of the staff. So they might not be doing the abusive behavior, the board members themselves, but by the lack of their action or just simply siding with the pastor in this regard, they are allowing that abuse to actually be perpetuated in the church. There's also the failure to name what is happening as abuse. And that means that there's no accountability that it can occur here. If it's not named as an abuse of thing, people just be like, it's church discipline. We're disciplining our staff, right? No, you're abusing people. There's a difference between church discipline, which is meant to be holistic and restore a person to the life of the church, than just abuse, which is meant to destroy them and cause soul damage. And has a method, yes. The refusal to take the claims of the abuse seriously by the board is an act of betrayal to the staff and the community of faith. So by refusing to act, that itself is an act of betrayal. They're there to safeguard the life of the church. While the specific nature of the abuse is not known to us, I don't think we need to go into that. The traumatizing effects ripple through the whole community. The church itself, as a result, exists in the state of confusion and the state of anxiety. Because what do we do with this? On the one hand, the church is growing, it's doing well, but staff are being abused, and it's not a good situation for people. So as I mentioned about the sociocultural dynamics that possibly might be at work, we can kind of see some of this by the example that I gave here. The structure of the church, we can tell it's pretty patriarchal just by who is in the leadership position, who seems to be favored by it, both in church and society. We see that race, We didn't talk about the race of the pastor here, but considering that it is an 85% congregation of white people, we can see that that probably has some elements of it. We see gender issues, so notions of masculinity and balance of power. That might also be at work in the story. We don't know exactly, but it might also be there. Culturally, we know Atlanta is a big metropolis, but it's also a part of the Bible Belt. So some of the cultural dynamics of being in the Bible Belt might be playing out here. And we also can surmise, based on it, it's an evangelical church, that the theology is going to focus on the individual. There's going to be a heavy emphasis on the Bible being used. And then that the possible culture at work is a culture war influence, where we're on God's side, there's other people who are not on God's side, and we're in conflict with this. That could be a part of it. Again, I'm not giving these as like indications of what this particular congregation that I just made up in my mind is going on, but these are some of the things that we have to take note of when reviewing any congregation. What is the structure, the leadership structure? What is the dynamics of race? What are the dynamics of gender, culture? What kind of theology do they have? Because even our theology, while it might not be abusive, can set the conditions for abuse later on, especially if it says certain people have more power based on their gender than others do. All right, so confronting abuse. We're starting to learn how to identify what abuse might be, but to confront abuse, we have to understand the factors that contribute to it. My emphasis in this next section of this session is not so much on what does it mean to go to the person who is an abuser and confront them or anything like that. My focus rather is to understand the factors that contribute to it. Because if we're not willing to confront the factors that might contribute to the abuse taking place or how to respond to that abuse, we're not ever going to be successful in working towards repair. All right, so what we're going to see here is just understanding some of what psychologically and religiously goes on as human beings and sets the conditions for abuse in the first place. So understanding spiritual abuse in order to confront it, these are the factors producing and perpetuating abuse. So I'm going to be talking about sociobiological systems, and the best way that I can explain this is through the work of James Griffith, who explains that sociobiological systems did not originate as religious phenomena. They evolved to meet the practical needs of early humans, hunters and gatherers for survival. So now, however, they organize religious life along similar lines as were the social priorities of humans before them. So we think of our social dynamics as humans, but we also recognize that we're biological creatures who have emotional and psychological and physical needs, right? That's a biological aspect of us. Sometimes the social and biological come together to form systems where your need for food is met by the society that you're a part of, in the same way that your emotional needs and everything else. So I want you to think of the system of us as humans and how we interact with one another. This is true across the board. So when I'm talking about spiritual abuse and the church, I'm talking about something that grows out of us just being human. It's not distinctly, as James Griffith explains, a religious phenomenon. It comes from a place in just our very humanity. So we see some of these things at work through the following. Social hierarchy, which dictates an uneven distribution of power in groups so that some have more access and resources than others, and some do more of the work than others. I already said that, right? And religious social hierarchy often values obedience and submission in ways that open a door to exploitation, abuse, and self-neglect. All right, so the system here is one of social hierarchy, how the church is organized as a system. And we can see it's pretty patriarchal. and who gets to be the pastor and who is up there. We can see that plays out a lot in the life of the church. And so there's a built-in hierarchy, and there's a group of people who need to submit and obey, and there's a group of people, a very small group of people who have power over those people. Another need that comes as being a human is that we affiliate with one another as peers. So we're not just born into families, but we have the ability as humans to create bonds with people who probably were initially strangers to us, but can become like family to us. And in religious groups, we see this all the time. We talk about ourselves as a family, right? But we're not in the true biological sense. We're here, hopefully voluntarily. We're here together voluntarily, and because of that, we're meeting our need to be with others who provide some of those needs of family, right? Like being with a community of people provides emotional support, sometimes physical support. Other needs are met within that. So peer affiliation is a part of this picture. And peer affiliation, by the way, also explains why communities of people will operate with the member of the pack mentality, if you know what I'm talking about, where a behavior where it's like we act as one group and we can't see ourselves outside of that group. One thing that happens often within communities, especially in religious groups, is what they call editing of the self. So the church, James Griffith explains, contributes to the production of a fabricated self. The self that we often are in a community like a church is often fabricated. What do I mean by that? Not that it's fake, but we put on a certain self around each other and we act accordingly, right? We act out of that self. Whether it's just on Sunday morning that we act like that or throughout the whole week, we know, hey, I'm a Christian, I'm a member of this group, I'm to live this way. And so there's a part of editing the self. Now, why is this important for us when it comes to abuse? Well, suppression sometimes of individual desires can be used by groups to amplify commitment to the group. So we see this a lot in religious groups where they kind of force the editing upon you. Like for you to fit into this culture, you have to be this type of person. And you have to accept the way we do things. And you have to edit yourself and your own desires and your own needs in light of that. Then lastly, social emotions. We know these as the feelings of shame, humiliation, pride, honor, and guilt. These things act together to not only produce, but also to perpetuate abuse. According to James Griffith, each of these provides moment-to-moment modulation of social interactions, right? Like somebody does something shameful, you kind of know it as a community and you treat, whether intentionally or unintentionally, you treat them as being shameful to the life of the church because they did something that was bad. And so we can see that these social emotions, I mean, all through human organizations and people groups, these are always present. There's always a sense of honor, of shame, of humiliation, of pride. They're always there. It's up to us as the church really to respond to it and understand it. Moving on. So another part of understanding spiritual abuse to confront it. Remember, we're trying to understand the full picture of why abuse happens and why it's perpetuated. We see that there's a contrast between two types of behavior. There's individual behavior and collective behavior. And so engaging the complicity of people is kind of complicated. You have individual actors, but you also have groups of people, collective groups. You also have another group called bystanders who are just kind of there. They're seeing this happen. And so I want you to think this in your mind, imagine it in your mind as I ask you these questions. Where does the blame fall in our story of spiritual abuse? as you're thinking of it. You don't have to say anything out loud. Just think of it. Like, where does the blame fall in our story of spiritual abuse? On one individual, that is the pastor, a group, maybe the board, the leadership of the church, or the whole community? And how do we gauge complicity in such a situation? So for instance, because people still continue to attend that church, knowing that there might be something bad happening, are they complicit in the abuse by continuing to attend that church? See what I'm trying to do here? I'm trying to get us to think that for these systems to continue to operate, you need people there. And it's never just an individual act. They might do the truly horrendous thing, but how the community responds to it also tells us a little bit about their complicity in that behavior. And what we need to do if we're going to confront abuse is we need to recognize the network or web of complicity, as I'm going to call it, if we're going to responsibly work toward accountability and healing. This is where it's really important for us. Because just if the pastor in this scenario decided, you know what, people are starting to catch wind of my abusive behavior, I'm just going to go to another church. I'm going to move on. Now, the person that was perpetuating the abuse in these particular instances, yeah, they're gone. But does the church still have the conditions there where another pastor could come in and do the same thing? This is where we see these cycles can return over and over time if you're not focusing on the network, the system itself. Because somebody who's abusive is going to thrive in certain contexts more than they are in others. They're going to be caught in it, in other words, right away, because the system supposedly is there to help make sure that that does not happen. All right. So the next part, what happens after the abuse has occurred? This is really the most telling part in terms of how people respond to instances of spiritual abuse. What does the church do? What are some practices and strategies we can do? We could spend all day trying to understand everything that goes into abuse, like all the factors, the individuals, the collective behavior, all that comes together. But what are some things that we can be doing, not just to make sure that the abuse doesn't happen, but to seek repair after the abuse? And so I'm going to focus only on 4. I don't want you to think that just because I put this image up here that these are the only 4 things that we can do as a community, but I find it's a little bit easier for us to grab onto things if there's just a couple for us to focus on this morning. And so there could be many other forms of repair, but these are the 4: disruptive empathy, accountability, new systems, and new images. And we're going to see how all of those work together to work towards this thing called repair. Now, I'm going to be talking about disruptive empathy this morning for a reason, because empathy itself, and neuroscientists have captured this and understand this when it comes to our brains. Inside our brain, there is a part of our brain that is responsible for empathy. It's also the same part of the brain where we experience pain. So the reality of pain and empathy are there. So our ability to feel the pain of others comes from that same region. But neuroscientists will also show that empathy can be switched on and switched off, activated and deactivated. So for instance, there are some people who say that there's something wrong with empathy, that we shouldn't empathize, especially with certain groups of people. I've even heard talk of like the sin of empathy or toxic empathy. What they really mean is empathy is good as long as it is activated for our group of people that we like, but deactivated towards the people we don't like. So all of us have this empathy switch within us. It's there, like it's a reality, but how we engage it and activate it changes based on our social context. And so disruptive empathy is something that Rene Girard called for in order to shatter a certain illusion that we often have as humans, and that illusion is that the world is whole. So disruptive empathy recognizes how broken the world is and refuses to acknowledge it as whole. It refuses to deny, to lie, to pretend that all is normal. Thus, it brings the bystander back into history, not as a passive observer, but as a protagonist. Now, we kind of try to do this as Christians as we cultivate the practice of disruptive empathy through the corporate prayer of confession, to recognize that the world is broken, and we recognize the brokenness of this world. But recognizing that the world is broken and not whole allows us to respond with empathy in a way that if we just said, you know what, the world's as it should be, there's nothing we can do. That's also another mindset that people develop. There's nothing we can do. This is just the way it is. This is the way the world works. But disruptive empathy says, no, I'm not going to let that illusion keep me from practicing empathy towards people. In our story of spiritual abuse, the practice of disruptive empathy would not accept that what the pastor and the board are doing is normal. I want you to hear me on that. Like, somebody who's practicing disruptive empathy in that scenario would say, this is not good. This is broken. And just because this is the church leadership and our church organization, it needs to be addressed. That's what disruptive empathy does. It acknowledges that, hey, what's going on here is not right. Because then it would allow the community of faith to advocate on behalf of the victims and work towards change. This is one of the most important things for us to do as Christians, is to recognize that, yes, our churches are broken. Our institutions are broken. If we come to the mindset that the church, because it's the church, it's God's thing, is whole and there's nothing wrong with it, that's going to allow abuse to proliferate in the life of the church. And in fact, that's the reason why many times it gets brushed aside, is because nothing bad can happen in the church. Are you kidding me? Next, we need to understand the necessity of accountability. A key part in addressing spiritual abuse is the acknowledgement, number one, that the victim has suffered beyond just offering platitudes and self-serving apologies. You'll often see self-serving apologies done by pastors after they've been caught in something that was abusive, and they go before the congregation, and it just seems like it's more about them than it is about the person who was victimized by their behavior. But what we need to do, if we're going to work towards accountability, is listen to what people who've been abused and what they have to say. Howard Zur, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, said this, and this is like one of those money quotes. He said that victims must be key stakeholders rather than footnotes in the justice process. So anybody that's victimized or abused needs to be a stakeholder rather than a footnote in the justice process. The reason why a lot of people do not come forward and even use this in the court of law, come forward to address abuse, is because that process makes them feel like footnotes, not stakeholders in it. A lot of women who have been abused, to say that they have been abused by even their husbands in the court of law, like sometimes they're treated like footnotes in the process, and their agency is taken away another time by the justice system that we've set up. So we have to work towards a process that allows victims to be a stakeholder. But justice and healing also require the work of accountability, because accountability is not merely retributive or punitive. A more holistic and systemic approach involves rehabilitation and restoration, so that complicity at all levels is acknowledged and acted upon responsibly. Judith Herman, in her book, Truth and Repair, asks some vital questions. What might it mean to hold perpetrators accountable for repairing the harm that they have done? What might it mean to hold bystanders accountable for acts of complicity and collusion? And what about acts of omission, indifference, or willful blindness? So one of the things that Herman does is detail the process of restorative circles. Believe it or not, humans have developed various ways to deal with elements of all sorts of things, from crime or just things that happen within communities. And there are some cultures, particularly indigenous cultures, where the community comes together to figuratively circle together. And the perpetrator and the person who was abused, it's not just them in the scenario, it's the entire community taking ownership for what's going on. And that way they're working towards rehabilitation and restoration, rather than just, we need to punish this individual for what they did. I think one of the reasons why we prefer just punishing people who have done terrible things is because it doesn't require anything of us as a community doing. The court will take care of it. They'll lock them away. We don't have to pay attention then to the structures that we have set up that probably set the conditions for that terrible thing to happen, because we're not willing to take that extra step and responsibility to do the work. So some questions relating to the story above. In what ways could those who have been abused be given the opportunity to have their abuse acknowledged that makes them stakeholders, not footnotes in the justice process? How can they do that? How can the pastor and the board be held accountable? And what level of complicity must the congregation itself acknowledge they are complicit for? So that's why accountability is an important part of repairing afterwards. The next thing to do in repairing or the work of repair can also help us make sure that we set up systems that don't produce these situations to occur, is the construction of new systems, new ways of organizing power. Remember what Judith Herman said: justice depends on the social organization of power. Power can be a good thing, but if you organize it in a bad way, it can cause harm. So when it comes to, remember, we talked about sociobiological systems, social hierarchy, what can we do to create new systems that don't allow these power imbalances to occur? We can work towards more egalitarian systems. In particular, where men aren't the only ones that get these positions of power. That's one way. There's many other ways that we can do that. Peer affiliation. We can learn to appreciate, respect, and value diversity. James Griffith comes up with this concept of whole person relatedness, and he defines it as that opening of oneself and responding fully to the other as a person. That involves interest in understanding the other's experience, despite their differences, distinctions about social class or status, class, ethnicity, gender, or other such group categories are put aside. Whole person relatedness fosters dialogue in which back and forth speaking, listening, and reflecting occur. So it's learning to be a whole person in regards to another person and acknowledging they are a whole person in our relationships. Well, how wonderful would it be to be a part of a community where that happens, where you don't feel like you have to edit yourself, where you don't have to fabricate yourself in order to fit in to that community. That's what he's talking about with whole-person relatedness. I can be who I am, you can be who you are, and we can still value one another within that. And so one of the things that has always helped me understand what it means to be a new system of organization and power is to contrast systems of hope versus systems of despair. In contrasting these systems of hope and despair, I'm emphasizing the importance of justice and healing in how we organize ourselves as a church. Our structure as a church, in other words, can either lead to a place where people experience hope for the future or they experience despair. The structures that we create, or the systems we create, should involve trust, not fear. Because trust will lead us to hope. Fear will lead us to a path of despair. And our structure as a church should allow people to have a genuine, true experience of hope. This can be done if spiritual abuse is confronted appropriately and responded to in a way that is restorative. One of the things that we have to understand is that just because you have a system in place that is meant to make sure that abuse doesn't happen and that abuse is handled appropriately doesn't mean that people are actually going to abide by that system when push comes to shove. Like our church has a safe sanctuaries policy to guard our vulnerable population of young people and older adults. But just because we have it in place, written down on a piece of paper, doesn't mean that we're actually going to live it. So we have to make sure that we live that system and be intentional about it if it's going to have its benefits. Because you can have anything down on paper, but if you don't have any will to actually act according to it, you can cause damage. That's why it might seem like I'm picking on evangelical and non-denominational churches in my example. It's just easier for me to show the patriarchy in those examples because that's usually what you see in those contexts. It could happen in Methodist churches, any church, right? We have these systems in place, but we need people to actually carry them out. This last part deals with our images for God, our images for ourselves, and our images for the community. I think if we are going to really work to a place where we not only perpetuate abuse, but work for repair, we have to change our images of God, of ourselves, and our community. So when it comes to God, everybody has a concept of God being a relational God. Like you go to any church, they're like, be in relationship with God. But just that notion alone won't acknowledge some of what can often be abused out of that relational God picture, right? Like if you just have an individualistic understanding of your relationship with God, then it will be easier for you to go to somebody who is struggling in their faith, who might be experiencing doubt, who might have suffered abuse, who might have anxiety, might have all these things. And if you have a very individualistic understanding of God, you might say things to that person that are spiritually abusive because of your way of conceiving of God. If you just had more faith in Jesus, you wouldn't experience all this doubt. If you just had faith in God, maybe that person wouldn't have abused you. We do these kinds of things all the time when we have these individualistic understandings of God. And we could spend all day on like what images of God nourish our spirits and what images of God actually are quite frightful and frightening when we consider them. We also have to change our views of ourselves. Every single one of us has a relational self because our self is constructed by our relationships with other people. We wouldn't be who we are without other people around us. That's how we become a self. James Newton Poling speaks of the bipolar self, that our self has sensitivity and creativity, in which we are formed by our relationships to others, so that's the sensitivity part. We all need other people to help us be who we are, but we also have the power to relate to others. That's the creativity part. But both need a healthy interaction. What often happens when abuse occurs is that it has deep effects due to the sensitivity of the self. Because we have a relational self, when I'm abused by somebody else, that affects me powerfully. It affects everybody powerfully, especially young people powerfully, because they are constructing their self. And when that abuse comes in, because they are in need of others to construct their self, that shapes who they are as a person. But creativity of the self can produce new patterns of relationships to take effect. So for us as people who want to help people who have experienced abuse, we can create new patterns of relationships that help those abused victims begin to experience the good effects of being in community, that they're included, that they're welcome, that they're valued by God. So we can see the self can be affected by abuse, and we have the power to help shape the lives of others, and we need to be aware of that in the way that we do things. And then community, loving communities are inclusive. They value the interior experiences of every person and create environments that embrace life in its fullness. And they are just. They have the courage to confront the abuse of power within the community and in the larger society. So when we're talking about new images, we're just challenging our ways. How do we think about God, ourselves, and community? And we have to understand that sometimes our images of God, while maybe not intentionally that way, can cause abusive things to happen just based on the way we conceive of God. I hope you can understand that point. That's a really important thing for us to continue to look to the gospel and see Jesus Christ as someone who is about being life-giving and giving life to other people, not depriving them of that. And so we have to constantly challenge our images of God. Same with the community. How do we view the community? Is this a community where all people are welcome? Is this a community where those who have experienced spiritual abuse can find something that's healing and helps produce justice? Now, I'm going to briefly go through some of these resources with you because I quoted them and I feel like I have to bring them up. They might be good for you to consider at some point if you want to dig a little bit deeper than I have this afternoon with you. So first, Victoria Barnett put out a book on bystanders, specifically focused on conscience and complicity during the Holocaust. So if you want to know, why did people in Germany stand by while all these atrocities were happening? You might not feel as confident about your ability in the face of atrocity to stand up, but it's a good read to help us understand how we could practice disruptive empathy and overcome those things within us that often cause us to just let the abuse continue. James Griffith wrote a book called Religion That Heals, Religion That Harms, a clinical guide. This is really like a clinical thing, so I wouldn't recommend it if you don't really want to go too clinical with things, but it does show how religion has the potential to both heal and harm at the same time. We just need to find healthy ways to construct it. Judith Herman has done a lot of work on abuse, especially to women. And she wrote a book called Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. So basically looking at how victims of abuse, how they would say, this is what happens and this is what we need to do. And the answers may surprise you. Another book, I didn't allude to it too much, but Terror in the Mind of God, The Global Rise of Religious Violence. I've just focused on spiritual abuse that happens within a local community, but we can see that sometimes spiritual abuse can take shape across entire populations and even the globe itself with acts of terror and religious violence. And then James Newton Polling's book, The Abuse of Power, A Theological Problem, is really good as well. In particular, James Newton Pauling, he worked in prisons with the perpetrators of abuse and working towards rehabilitation, which is not work that a lot of people want to do because that's pretty heavy, and there's a lot of judgment that goes into that. So those are some resources, and I just did this to train you to think a little bit this morning. Like, this is a provocative question for discussion amongst yourselves afterwards. In what ways can evangelism be an act of or perpetuate spiritual abuse? What I'm trying to ask with this question for you to ponder is it possible for us to evangelize other people that does not involves some form of spiritual abuse. Because the way that we often see evangelism done, what does it do? Basically, in my mind, what it does is it wounds in order to provide the remedy. So what does it do? It goes and says, you're a sinner. You need to be saved by God. You've done all these terrible things. And here's the remedy. And if you just pray this prayer, you'll be good. Huh?
I said we use stickers.
Yeah. I'm not saying that evangelism itself is a bad thing. I'm just saying, in what ways can evangelism be an act of or perpetuate spiritual abuse? And we have to recognize that, right? Because there have been a lot of abusive forms of it, and we need to be understanding. In fact, the people that we might be going to, if we don't know them very well, we might unintentionally cause spiritual harm to them because we're not aware of it. All right, well, I want to thank you for being here and staying and depriving yourselves of lunch before you go off, but thank you. If you have any questions, just let me know.